we've defined perfectionism over the years as different than some other people in the field. So we don't look at perfectionism as simply an attitude or a set of attitudes or a set of cognitions. Rather, we look at perfectionism as a very broad, sort of multi-layered and multi-level personality style or interpersonal style. And so it has multi-layers. It's quite complex. We think of it because of these different layers and dimensions as more of a way of interacting with the world. It's a way of being in the world rather than a way of thinking or a way of simply behaving. And so we've defined it in terms of like other personality variables in terms of traits, as well as it's not just traits, but it's also the processes that are involved in the expression of those traits. So by that I mean there can be different, well, let me say it this way. With the traits, personality traits provide energy and a drive for behaviors. And we have talked about early on three major traits of perfectionism, and one is known as self-oriented perfectionism, which is the requirement for the self to be perfect. Not to be excellent, not to be really good, but to be perfect. And so if I require myself or I demand perfection of myself, that's what we're talking about with self-oriented perfectionism. Usually what people think of when they first think of perfectionism. A second trait is other-oriented perfectionism, where it's not that I require myself to be perfect, but instead I require others to be perfect. My children, my students, my spouse, everybody in the world, whatever that might look like. So again, it's I need other people to be perfect. What goes along with both self-oriented and other-oriented is this criticalness that occurs when perfection is not attained. The third component, which came directly out of my clinical work early on, it seemed to be that there were these other people who seemingly needed to be perfect, but it wasn't that they themselves needed themselves to be perfect. It was a perception that others required them to be perfect. And the others could be parents or one's boss or, again, people in general in the world require me to be perfect. And I can't be perfect. So those are the traits, self-oriented, other-oriented, and socially prescribed perfectionism traits. Now, with the traits, again, from my clinical work, it became clear early on that these traits seem to reflect a powerful need to be perfect or a concern with being perfect. Essentially, it was, I need myself to be perfect, or I need others to be perfect. Then doing clinical work with perfectionistic people, it became clear that there were people who were very perfectionistic, but it wasn't that they needed to be perfect. They needed to present themselves to the world as if they were perfect. So again, it's not that an individual would be driving or striving to try to be perfect. They were, when interacting with others, trying to show other people, hey, I am perfect. And so this is known as sort of the process element of personality. It's the expression interpersonally of perfectionism. And so we began to fill out this conceptualization a little bit more. And it looked like there were three ways, there's sort of three ways that I can try to convince you that I am perfect. One is by telling you I am perfect, or promoting myself as perfect, so that I try to convince you that, yes, I'm a perfect being. And we call that perfectionistic self-promotion. Another way for me to try to convince you that I'm perfect is to never show you any behaviors of mine that would be that I would engage in that were less than perfect. So I will not show you anything that might be flawed. I might not show you, that I'm a horrible tennis player. I might not speak publicly because I might show you that I'm nervous or that sort of thing. So I'm never going to show you any imperfection, with the idea being that I will not reveal to you any flaw that I might have. And then the third component, and that's known as the non-display of imperfections. And the third element is, and this is a particularly pernicious one, is I will not disclose or tell you or admit to you verbally any imperfection that I have. So I won't tell you about things that are not going well in my life, or things that you might perceive as less than perfect in me. And if you think about the development of intimacy with another person, it's all about revealing the self, both the lovely things about yourself, as well as some of the things that maybe are fears or liabilities, and that's how we develop intimacy. So you can see with these perfectionistic self-presentational elements, it has a powerful impact on relationships with others. So that's a second component of how we define perfectionism. The third involves sort of the relationship one has with oneself. The best way to kind of capture this is, every day we get up, we have this internal dialogue with ourselves. We're chatting away with ourselves. We get up and say, okay, I got to brush my teeth now. I better get that done quickly. I'm going to be late. I'm going to miss the bus. And you just have this dialogue that's internal. And like other dialogues, if you carefully look at the dialogue, it can reflect the nature of a relationship you have with yourself. So for example, many of us have been self-critical or are self-critical at certain points in our lives or certain times a day, that sort of thing. And we have this dialogue, how could I be so stupid? Why did I do that? And you kind of have this dialogue. And again, if you look at the content of the dialogue, it can reflect the nature of relationship you have with yourself. So hopefully all of us would have a dialogue at some points that would say, that was a really good job. You worked really hard on that. You need to feel good about yourself. You attained that goal, etc., etc. But for perfectionistic people, they have these harsh, critical, sort of nasty kinds of internal dialogue. And we refer to that as automatic perfectionistic cognitions. So this dialogue that says, I need to be perfect, I have to be perfect, or I should have done that perfectly, how could I failed at that. And so this dialogue that reflects perfectionism, but also a really harsh, negative, nasty self-dialogue, especially at times after some task or some performance, where how could I be so stupid? I'm never going to be cared for. I can't believe I made that mistake. And this harsh nastiness. And so we've got these three components, and you can see that we view perfectionism as quite a complex personality style that reflects traits that drive and energize behavior consistently. And then we have perfectionism that's sort of expressed in the relational world or interpersonal world with other people. And then we have these components that reflect the internal relational world, the kind of dialogue, the relationship we have with ourselves. And so perfectionism, we believe, operates at all of these different levels. Again, in the description of it, it's multi-layered, multi-dimensional, so there's no one definition or prototype of what a perfectionist might look like. It's a combination of elements of all these processes. Like many other people over decades who have written about perfectionism, one of the things that's very striking as you interact or especially do clinical work with people with perfectionism is there's a very powerful interpersonal component to it. And often people talk about not being connected to others in the world, not feeling that they fit or belong. They have worries about being accepted by others, worries about being rejected or abandoned. And often their perfectionistic behaviors attempts to serve the purpose to feel connected with other people and to try to correct the sense of being flawed or defective. Now, in the work that we did in terms of trying to understand where it comes from, because I have a psychodynamic orientation, and for decades people have talked about the importance of attachment styles, and there's just a mountain of research that's supporting attachment styles and difficulties in attachment. We looked to early relationships with people where these attachment styles sort of arise. And in working with perfectionistic people, these themes come up all the time as you're talking to people and and you're working with them therapeutically. They talk about early experiences, early relational experiences. And so we've taken an attachment perspective to try to help understand where perfectionism might come from. And we've talked about the concept of, this is a term that we use, of asynchrony, that children, very young children, for example, part of the job of being a child is to learn how to feel safe and secure in the world. And children are learning machines. They learn everything. And one of the things that they will learn is how to feel safe and secure. And a big part of that is feeling connected with caregivers, connected with family, and so forth. Now, this is a powerful drive that's evident early on in infants' life about needing that connectedness to caregivers. And you can understand that a child will have particular needs that need to be met. And one of the needs is a sense of safety and security. And the way to get that need met is by a caregiver. If an infant does not form a connection with a caregiver, the infant won't survive. You have to have that bond, that connectedness in order for the child to survive. So that's hardwired into us. So in these interactions, what we surmised was that this sense of fitting and belonging and being safe isn't quite met in early relationships, in family relationships, and as the child continues to grow up, as they have this sense of not quite being safe, not quite fitting, not quite being accepted, and they work hard to try to deal with that. And so one of the ways to make themselves feel accepted or belonging or get their needs for this interpersonal safety met is, if I am perfect, then I won't be rejected, then I will be accepted, then I will feel safe and secure in the world. And unfortunately, in some families, it's not necessarily that the parents are bad or neglectful. In some cases, that's absolutely true, and you will see perfectionism arising in those situations. But in other cases, there can simply be what the child needs is here, and what the parent can provide in that moment, they just miss. And one of the things that can happen is children, when those needs are not met, can develop these insecure attachment styles, meaning I can't rely on other people to provide a sense of safety, a sense of security. And they deal with that by trying, the solution is, if I am perfect or if I look perfect, maybe I can get those needs met. At the same time as these working models of others about how they come to have person schemas that other people are potentially incapable of helping me or incapable of providing me with security, or other people are going to judge and reject me. They also have, because children understand the world in relation to themselves, they have a sense of there's something wrong with me. I am defective, I am flawed, and in order to correct that, in order to feel like I am okay in the world, in order for me to have self-esteem, again, I need to be accepted by other people, I need to fit into the world. And the solution to that, again, is by trying to be perfect or trying to appear perfect. So now, when children develop these insecure attachments, they tend to carry them, and there's very good evidence of this in the attachment literature, they tend to carry those interpersonal styles throughout their life. And so they tend to repeat this pattern of, if I am perfect, then other people will accept me, will care for me, I will be okay in the world, I won't be defective anymore because I found a place to fit. And they try to do that by being perfect. The problem comes in because perfectionistic people tend to be, they can be hard to interact with, they can be hard to connect with. So other people will perceive perfectionistic people as distant, they're cautious, they're hard to get to know, or they can be quite hostile and aggressive. And so what happens is you have these individuals whose powerful motivation is to feel connected, to feel respected, cared for, not abandoned, to feel like they're not flawed and defective. And actually, by engaging in their perfectionism to try to solve those problems, they actually push people away and create more difficulties for themselves. So you see this repeated again and again in relationships with other people, but also the relationship that the person has with him or herself. And so the development of perfectionism, or where it comes from, kind of starts with these very early models of how to feel connected to people in the world, how to find a place to fit, and how to fix a sense of being flawed or defective. And that gets repeated over the course of their life. Okay, yeah, the treatment follows directly from that model that I just spoke to you about where perfectionism comes from. In the treatment of perfectionism, we tend not to talk about perfectionism very much for individuals. What we're trying to do is to try to get underneath the perfectionism to help the patient kind of understand why the perfectionism is there, what purpose it serves for this particular individual in his or her life. And so we put together what's called a clinical formulation for patients, meaning we do a very detailed assessment with the person to come up with a model of how this patient's perfectionism works, where it came from for this person, what it's intended to do, how the person kind of got there, what the perfectionism looks like for that individual, and the problems that it causes. And so we, instead of being interested in diagnosis, I mean, we are interested in the pain the person is in, but we don't deal with the symptoms. We don't focus on symptoms. We look what's underneath the symptoms, in the belief that we need to look at the cause of the symptoms or cause of the problems. And so we look at those interpersonal or those relational underpinnings of perfectionism. So we look at the need to fit, the need to belong, those sort of thwarted needs for connectedness with other people, the needs, the really powerful needs not to be rejected or abandoned, the need to feel like other people care and love them. I mean, these are needs we all have, but for these folks, those needs aren't met. And so we spend time looking at those needs. We also spend time looking at the relationship the person has with him or herself in terms of, for example, at some point in the treatment, we might say to a patient, if we took all the things you say to yourself when, you know, in that internal voice in your head about how horrible, how awful, how stupid you are, and you said those things to another person in your life, what would happen? And the individual usually says something like, well, I'd probably be arrested for abuse, or, you know, the relationships would end because I would be so horrifically horrible to this other person. And then we say, and yet that's the relationship you have with yourself. And we help the person try to get to a place to understand the nature of that relationship and what they actually do with themselves. We also look, you know, when we get to have a person kind of understand what purpose their perfectionism serves, it helps them to try other ways to try to maintain connectedness with other people. So the person learns, and it's not by being told this model, it's through experiences and that sort of thing, but they learn that when they try to be perfect or they try to appear perfect in order to have other people like them, it actually pushes people away. And then we can work with, when they really sort of understand that that's what's going on. It's not that they are hateful creatures, but their behavior, when they're trying to feel connected with other people, actually pushes people away. We can then work with them on other behaviors that maybe are more conducive to being connected with others. So for example, one of the things that is really difficult for very perfectionistic people is to be revealing of themselves, is to be really open in interactions with other people. As I said, they're very guarded. They're not going to show you behaviors that are imperfect. They're not going to admit to them. They're going to present themselves as perfect. And when we can actually help them understand that the way to intimacy is actually by revealing the selves, this can be a very frightening prospect from their perspective. But we help them kind of get to a place where they can actually do that. And that engenders not only intimacy or connectedness with people in the world, it also works to correct or help the relationship the person has with themselves, that they can begin to trust that maybe I am okay, maybe I can accept myself the way I am, as opposed to try to be this perfect person. So that's the idea behind the treatment. We've developed individual treatments that I've been doing for 30 years with patients. We've developed psychodynamic group treatments that are short-term. Right now, we're doing an RCT on a 12-session. We've evaluated the treatments in earlier research, showing that it seems to be quite effective in changing perfectionism traits and self-presentational facets and that internal dialogue. So we're very pleased with the results that we're showing, but we're trying to do more research to refine it, to make it better, and to evaluate the individual treatment as well.